This is Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy, the art of attracting, acquiring, and retaining talent. Here's Kathleen.
So the pandemic has given us insights into employee wellness and how mental and emotional health in the workplace should be defined. Last year, a survey found that 76% of workers felt that companies should be doing more to protect their employees' mental health. So how can organizations take steps to support mental health and wellness in the workplace? Well, we're going to be talking about this question and many others with my guest this week, Laura Putnam. She's the founder and CEO of Infusion, a San Francisco-based well-being consulting firm. She's also the author of Workplace Wellness That Works. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's great to be with you.
Well, to set the stage for our listeners, Laura, you and I met in October at the Arizona Human Resource Executive Summit and Retreat in lovely Prescott, Arizona. And I found you to be just a very, very engaging presenter on a topic that's really taking center stage over the past few years, mental health at work. So I thought to kick this off, Laura, I'd love for you to share with our listeners your diverse career journey and how you really became a leading voice for well-being at work.
Well, I call myself a former competitive gymnast, former professional dancer, former urban public high school teacher, former public policy worker, and international community organizer turned movement builder in the world of health and well-being, and particularly in the workplace. So I'm on a mission to get every individual, every team, and every organization in motion, literally, as in please don't have a seat, but also figuratively, as in making change. And so much of the conversation around well-being, including mental health, is really around this conundrum of closing the knowing and doing gap. That is, we all know what to do to improve our health and well-being, starting with the three basics: eat healthy, get active, don't smoke. But less than 3% of Americans do those three simple things. And so to address that pervasive knowing and doing gap, I really lean into my background as an urban public high school teacher working in challenging underserved schools, where if there's any training ground for looking at this issue of behavior change and culture change and how we inspire others to close the knowing and doing gap, I can't think of any better training ground than that one.
So let's talk about that, because I do want to talk about your book. And, but let's just talk about the behavior change and the awareness around that. So how do you start that conversation?
Well, it's interesting, Kathleen, because this whole behavior change conversation has been one that we've been having for a long time now in the field of well-being, in the field of wellness, in the field of workplace wellness and well-being. And it has been framed up around the assumption that the individual is the one who's ultimately responsible, and that better health and well-being is within reach for every individual as long as they, quote, just take more personal responsibility. But the problem is that a growing body of evidence really suggests that this is much, much more than just individual habit formation or helping individuals to get more motivated. But this is much more about a change in culture and environment that surrounds us. So case in point, in October of this year, the top obesity researchers around the world convened in London to talk about this rising issue of obesity, which, keep in mind, Kathleen, that this was virtually non-existent until the 80s. Suddenly, there was this rise in obesity. And it was so sudden that the researchers at the CDC actually thought it was a mistake in the data. But since that time, we have seen this exponential rise in obesity rates. So now 40% of Americans are not just overweight, but obese. And if we look at obesity and being overweight, that's affecting about 70% of Americans. Now, this is not happening just here in the US, but it's happening around the world. So, for example, the Middle East has countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia have some of the highest rates of obesity in the world. So these researchers gathered and they were like, why is this happening? And what can we do about it? And while there was a lot of disagreement around what the underlying causes might be, so people are speculating that it might be things like the rise in so-called ultra-processed foods, or it might even be the impact of our environment, changes in our environment, or it might even be fertilizer that's kind of impacted our food supply. But while there was different opinions on that, there was 100% agreement around this idea that this is not a personal responsibility issue. And if we continue to frame this up as a personal responsibility issue, we will not make headway on this issue. So getting back to your earlier question about behavior change, we have to begin to reframe the whole conversation around behavior change around we can't just look at this around what the individual needs to be doing differently. We need to think more around the context within which the individual operates. And that's what calls for more collective action. So thinking about what can we do in every community to make health and well-being more normal, more within reach for everyone? What can we do in every workplace? What can we do within every team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting as I sit back and think about the evolution, because I started I graduated from college in the early 80s. And, really that wasn't much of a conversation going on around wellness. And then all of a sudden it was, it started picking up, but it was more about a personal thing as opposed to reframing that conversation. And I think that's really where you are going with your book. And I'd really like to dissect the book that you have. So it's Workplace Wellness That Works. So everybody get onto Amazon right now and buy it because it's terrific. It's 10 steps to infuse well-being and vitality into any organization. And as I was reading this, you clearly wrote this as a playbook. And it's really something to help me as a leader to guide my organization. And I love how you use the phrase to start this movement. And so you outline 10 steps in your book. And I know that we can only eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So I'd like to go through each step briefly and, talk about them because you break this 10-step process into 3 phases. And your first phase is that getting started. And so kind of walk us through the 4 steps that are part of the first phase.
The first is that when I wrote this book, it was really a nod to a lot of what I was seeing in mainstream media around workplace wellness not working. And in fact, there was a New York Times article that was titled, "Do Workplace Wellness Programs Work? ? Usually not." And so there was a lot of this conversation of kind of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as opposed to really looking at, well, okay, given what we're facing with this rise in chronic conditions and disease, such as obesity, such as heart disease, such as diabetes, the idea of leveraging every workplace, if we consider that's where the vast majority of adults are spending their time, whether it's in person or virtually, is a really, really good idea. But just because it's not working in many cases doesn't mean that it's a bad idea. We just need to start doing it better. So that's the whole intent behind this book. And so big picture, it's like people aren't motivated to be part of yet another program, but they are motivated to be part of a movement. So the first phase, as you just mentioned, is to start the movement. And within that, the first step is that if we are the ones who are launching that movement within our organization, we need to first and foremost shift our mindset from expert to agent of change. And so while we need to leverage the research that is out there and the expertise that is out there, the research that is out there, we really need to put on our Oprah Winfrey hat and channel our our inner Oprah to really launch a movement, because I would argue that it is agents of change like Oprah Winfrey who have probably changed our behaviors more than any expert who is out there. So what are those best practices that these agents of change use? And one of them is that they speak to the heart. They don't just speak to the brain. So it's thinking about using storytelling, for example, as opposed to just giving another statistic. The next step in this is to imagine what's possible. And so I love, for example, Maya Angelou once said, "My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to fully thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." So I get people to think about in my keynotes and my workshops around this idea of me at my best. What does that look like for you? And how might you become more of that? And so it's, well, the basics of wellness, eat better, get active, don't smoke, are important. There are also multiple dimensions of well-being that we need to consider, particularly things like social well-being. Am I loved, and am I loving well? That may well be the most important aspect of well-being, something that really has come front and center during the pandemic, and that the toll that the pandemic has taken on our social well-being, not to mention our emotional well-being. And then the third step is that we start to uncover the hidden factors, which is take a deep dive into the culture and really start to assess, is this a culture in our organization that will actually support well-being? So is there a culture in which people feel like that they have to be chained to their desks all day? Is there a culture in which people feel like that they have to always be on? Is there a culture of toxicity? These are the kinds of things that really need to be addressed. And so often what I see is a mismatch between the well-intentioned wellness programs and then the larger culture. And then finally, the fourth step in this is to start with what's right. How can we, so many of these wellness programs begin with this, diagnosing what's wrong with people through these health risk assessments. You're overweight, you're stressed out. And then we expect people to get excited about engaging with these programs. So instead, there's a lot of power to helping people to first identify what they're doing right. Like, I'm in a really loving relationship and the work that I do really inspires me. Now, how can I build on those bright spots to address some of my challenges?
I love that. Yeah. So then the next one, so now we've started, we've actually gotten off the couch, right? And so now it's time to build it. And you talk about the workplace wellness that grows, and there's 2 steps to that.
The first one is to take a Da Vinci approach to change. And so we really need to reach across the aisle and really, make sure that it's not just HR who's spearheading this, but that this is really happening across all departments across the organization. And that we're really thinking about channeling our inner Da Vinci, whereby we take a multidisciplinary approach to this in solving this conundrum and in really building this movement of well-being across the organization. So what is it that we can lean into with talent development, for example? How can we lean into marketing? That's a big one. How can we lean into what the legal department can tell us about this? And then the next step is to really think about how we might go stealth, which is, the moment you start to mention wellness, a lot of people will turn the other way. So how can we recast this in language that resonates for people? So for example, a lot of people are more motivated around energy. Do I have the energy that I need to be an impactful leader and to build a high-performing team? And then we need to look for stealth opportunities rather than thinking about launching a standalone wellness program, how do we instead incorporate it into already standing initiatives such as leadership development, such as onboarding, or a big one is safety. So a lot of organizations really prioritize that. So how do you incorporate some well-being into those already existing initiatives?
Yeah, I really resonated with number 6, and to really sneak that in and to stay away from some of these, well, like you said, the a wellness initiative, because then people have that one paradigm, and then there's all the noise that goes along with it, and they don't listen to the other pieces of it.
And you know, another piece of that, Kathleen, is that what the research repeatedly shows is that if it's a wellness initiative and if it's labeled as that, it tends to attract the people who are already healthy. And we're
Hmm.
really trying to reach everyone, and we can't ignore the fact that the largest study to date on the impact of workplace wellness shows that 80% of eligible employees simply opt out. And that hasn't changed much, even with all of our efforts to do better on that. So, using strategies like going stealth is really important.
Yeah. So let's talk about the final phase, make it last. What are the steps in that one?
So, this begins first and foremost with this idea of creating meaning. And you know, Kathleen, this is something, this idea of creating meaning has really come front and center with the pandemic and all that has come with it. We might say that the pandemic, and you know, kind of the impact of that, the residual effects of that, that's really manifested in the Great Resignation, in quiet quitting, that we're seeing now, is it's kind of been a time of the Great Reset, whereby people are really looking at what matters most. And so creating meaning is really about tapping into those deepest human psychological needs that we all share. So, in thinking about creating these well being programs, how do we make sure that we tap into those things that matter most? So, things like autonomy, and autonomy defined as really flexibility. And certainly that's something that we've seen come front and center. People want flexibility in where they work and how they work and when they work. And so if we want to really engage people, we need to be thinking about those deepest human needs like autonomy, like purpose, and like connection with one another. The next step after that is to design nudges and cues. So this is really about thinking, you know, getting back to this concept that was in step 3 around the importance of addressing the culture and really taking a deep dive into the culture. Is it one that supports well-being, or is it by definition one that's antithetical to it? So how do we think about optimizing the environment and the culture around people so that they don't even have to think about it? It becomes less of a load on the individual and more about, you know, when I come to work, whether it's in person and virtual, I just naturally am nudged toward the healthier choice. So there's a lot of systems in place that enable me to be my best self. So if I'm in person, for example, there's healthy options for me to choose from. Every meeting we have, there's healthy options. But it's also things like the workplace itself is one in which I feel cared for when I come to work. So that's not a culture of toxicity. The next step is to launch and iterate. So this is really about learning through doing, and we measure along the way. And then finally is to go global, which is what are some best practices that we see around the world? And probably one of the best examples of that are these blue zones. What are some of the, you know, these are these hotspots of longevity around the world, places like Ikaria, Greece, or places like Sardinia in Italy, or Okinawa in Japan. What are those things that people are doing in those places that are where they're not only living but thriving into their hundreds? What are those best practices that we see in those places, and how might we bring that to every workplace?
I love the whole concept of again, the book as a guide, and that they don't have to be executed in any certain order. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a step, and so you can kind of pick and choose the steps that really fit into your organization. And so, you know, as I was going through this and really even looking at my own organization, you know, I was thinking about step number 7. And one of the things you say is to stay away from incentives and go deeper by connecting with intrinsic human needs, such as competency, the autonomy that you spoke about. But one of the other bullet items that you had was play. And that has been something that we are have really been looking at more intentionally here at Duffy Group, and actually one of my other podcast guests, Jeff Harry, is a positive psychologist, and he talked about the benefit of play at work, and so we've been bringing that into our workforce. And what's interesting is that we are a virtual company, and we have always been a virtual company. The pandemic did not change that for us, but one of our core values was around work-life harmony. That that you talk about the whole flexibility, and I think because of that, I've been successful of attracting and retaining some really great talent, because we have always allowed people to integrate work and non-work demands. What's been interesting for me as a leader is that most of my employee base were people who were probably in the workforce for 10 or more years. And now we are hiring a lot more new college grads, people with a few years of work experience. And we're really seeing a whole difference in terms of the things that I need to be aware of as a leader, as to how to support this emotional and mental health well-being for my Gen Zers, if you will. Are you seeing that with other organizations too?
Play is such an interesting topic, because I think we see it as being kind of superfluous. We don't come to work to play. We come to work to work. But play is so fascinating, just how much we are hardwired to play and what the benefits are. And particularly how play, and actually lack thereof, has, forgive the pun, but has played out for younger generations. So hear me out on this. I've been really fascinated by this guy, Peter Gray, who is a researcher at Boston University. And he's been looking at how there's been a decline in so-called free play for children. And so free play is self-directed play. So Kathleen, for you and I, when we were kids, we engaged in a lot of free play, where our parents would just kind of say, go out there and play with your friends and come back for dinner. And there was no adult supervising us. And nowadays, and particularly for younger workers who are entering the workforce now, play looked very different for them, and whereby it was mostly supervised and it was structured play. And what Peter Gray has been looking into is the cost of that loss in free play. And one of the things that free play apparently does is it helps us as children to develop these so-called, a sense of a locus of control. And that is, we kind of learn how, there's natural ups and downs in life. And, but we have this sense of, our internal sense of control. So for example, when we're playing as kids without supervision, we have these conflicts and we learn how to work them out without the intervention of an adult. So we develop this locus sense of control. And as it turns out, having that is so important as we get older. And a lot of these younger people really haven't developed that. So they're much more susceptible to life's circumstances, as opposed to being able to effectively navigate them. So it is so important for us now in the workplace to be thinking about fostering more play. That helps to develop that locus of control, but it also helps to foster more friendship in the workplace. And we know, for example, that those people who have not just a good friend, but a best friend at work are 7 times more likely to be highly engaged in their work. We know that it fosters trust, and those teams that have a high level of trust are 12 times more likely to be highly engaged engaged in their work. And it also really helps to foster culture and a sense of belonging. And so all of these are huge benefits that come from play.
And I think people don't necessarily understand what play means. Jeff talks about this zone of genius when you're doing what you really, really love to do.
That's right.
Okay, well, hang on, Laura. We have to take a break. But coming up in the second part of my conversation with Laura Putnam, the founder and CEO of Motion Infusion, Laura shares how the pandemic has opened up to leaders the importance of well-being.
Pretty much everybody, particularly leaders, recognize that well-being is no longer a nice to have, but it is a must-have. And people are voting with their feet. They want well-being in a true sense, a true and authentic self. And if they're not getting that with the organization that they work with, then they're either actually leaving or they're quietly quitting.
This has been Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy. To connect with Kathleen or to learn more about recruitment research, go to duffygroup.com.